everyone, and welcome back. Thanks again to Arthur Nicolette, CEO of Transdev Canada, for a great one-on-one. It's now time to head into our final panel of the day. This panel is going to bring together experts from the financial sector to highlight growing investor expectations on ESG and sustainability disclosure and performance. And our panelists are going to discuss evolving conditions for attracting capital, investment, and how corporate sustainability programs have become a key consideration for financial stakeholders. First, I should introduce myself. My name is Sandra Odendahl, and I'm the SVP of Sustainability and Diversity at BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada. I also oversee the bank's strategic partnerships with organizations that help BDC expand our reach, our knowledge, and our impact. In case you don't know BDC, BDC is Canada's Bank for Entrepreneurs. We're a federal crown corp with a mission to support Canadian economic growth and job creation, helping entrepreneurs to grow and scale up their small and medium-sized businesses. And we're also a B Corp. And now I want to introduce the amazing panel that we have for you today. I'm going to start with Marie-Justine Labelle. Marie-Justine is the head of responsible investment for retail at Desjardins. Welcome, Marie-Justine. Next, we have Nicole Vidori. So Nicole is the VP and head of environment for TD Bank Financial Group. We next have Yvan Deschamps, who's Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer for Laurentian Bank. And then last but not least, welcome Steve Robbins, who's the Head of Strategy for the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. So welcome panel, and I think we're going to dive into some questions and some discussion. I want to start actually with something that I'd like to pose to all of you, and it's really about how sustainability and ESG looks from your perspective. So just to frame that, over the last couple of years, we've seen record inflows and expanding choices for investors, with global sustainable fund assets estimated at almost $4 trillion distributed among 7,000 ESG funds around the world. At the same time, we've seen a proliferation of ESG rating tools and benchmarking standards to facilitate investments. And of course, for the financial sector, this means a lot of things, and at least three of them are: number one, asset managers are looking to meet investor expectations for sustainable products, services, and advice. Number two, lenders are thinking about how they're going to embed sustainability in their own portfolios. And then I would say number three is that lenders and investors are all looking at how sustainability, and in particular, the recognition of the need to address climate change, how does that translate into new financing opportunities? So that's a bit of context. So what I'd like to ask each of you in turn is if the panelists can take 2 or 3 minutes each and give the audience an overview of how your organization is approaching the concept of ESG and sustainable finance. And of course, you can use this as an opportunity to highlight some of your organization's recent accomplishments, if you like. I'm going to ask Marie-Justine to start, if that's okay. Marie-Justine?
Hi, Sandra. Thank you. And thank you for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce for having us for this panel. So yes, ESG and sustainable finance is very important to Desjardins. And I guess if we go all the way back to our creation in 1900, the very reason why we were created was to serve communities that were underserved by the financial sector at the time. So it's always been at the heart of our mission to work towards the well-being of society. And the way that we see this evolves with how the challenges that society faces evolves. So with sustainable development being one of the defining challenges of our times for current and future communities, this is something that's really important to us. And that's why we integrate environmental, social, and governance considerations in all of our lines of business. If I take just one example on the investment side, so we launched one of the very first environmental funds in Canada in 1990, and we've continued innovating all the way to today, that we have the largest product shelf in the Canadian market in terms of responsible investment funds. So that's something we're very proud about. We've also taken kind of proactive positions and a few ESG themes that are particularly important nowadays, like climate, that we'll talk about later. Diversity and inclusion is another one. So our CEO won a prize from Catalyst Canada in 2020 for everything that is done in terms of advancing women in the organization. And we now have a full roadmap for equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'll stop there because of time. Thank you.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks very much. And yeah, Desjardins' investment work in sustainability investing has been really leading in the sector, I think. But now we're going to hear from a couple of the others. Nicole, do you want to address the question next in terms of
Sure.
yeah, some of the highlights really on ESG and sustainable finance for TD?
Yeah, thanks, Sandra, and thank you for inviting me to be here. The way we're looking at ESG is really as an overlay to everything that we do versus a sideshow. And the way this plays out is like, first, you want to identify for each activity or transaction that you're doing, what is the E&S impact, if any, and how do you mitigate that? But, the ideal state is there a way to structure this such that we can provide an environmental or social benefit alongside with the transaction? And that's the exciting part. And if you think about the bank and all the different arms of the bank, sustainable finance plays out in really fascinating and unique ways. So we already talked about from Desjardins, and Sandra, you mentioned this in your opening comments about funds. So we have an asset management arm and a wealth arm that also produces ESG themed funds. We also have a TD Securities, and they're very active in underwriting and advising on green bonds, sustainability linked loans. And they've also recently set up a carbon trading desk. We also have the business bank, and you mentioned this as well. How do we embed sustainability KPIs within our lending products? And I think what's unique for TD is we have an insurance arm as well. And as we know, insurance is one of the hardest hit industries from the physical risks of climate change. So how can we embed resiliency into our policies and really reward our customers who are taking those mitigation or adaptive measures in their homes? I think as I look to the future, though, our focus for sustainable finance is going to get very surgical, if I may. We've set this net zero by 2050 target, and we really want to test out how can we use sustainable finance across the enterprise to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions within our financing portfolio. So, I don't have all the answers, more to come on that, but I think it's going to be a really neat few years ahead.
Yeah, embedding using sustainable finance to get to net zero, I think, is something that it will resonate with everybody on this panel, and I'm sure lots of people in the audience. So hopefully we can unpack that a little bit further as well. Thanks very much for that. That's great. I'm going to ask next Yvan, if you'd like to weigh in. Basically, same question. And obviously same invitation to flag some highlights right now.
Thank you, Sandra, for facilitating the discussion, and thank you to the Chamber for inviting me and Laurentian Bank to share what's really important for us. ESG is really at the core of the strategy that we're putting together, as well as core values for the bank. So really happy to be here with all of you today. So Laurentian Bank was built on a foundation for equity, and for us, we're there also to be the banker for the underserved. So for us, it's really important, and ESG, as I mentioned, is really at the core of it. The focus that we have at the ESG level is really starting from a governance of the bank perspective and really a buy-in at all the levels, including the highest levels of the bank. So first, the CEO, Rania Llewellyn, is the ESG champion for the bank. So it really starts from the top and really flows through the organization. The executive committee is also very involved and leads the way as the ESG, ultimate committee for the bank. As a CFO, my role includes chairing our internal TCFD task force, really focused on the TCFD recommendation and the climate aspect of it. But all the aspects of ESG is part of not only the management, but also part of the board of director mandate and each of the committees that we have at the board of director also. And each of the executives at the bank have the ESG factors as part as the executive scorecards that we have, which leads to our compensation at the end of the year. So it's really embedded throughout the organization. We did publish last year our first ESG report, and we highlighted a lot of accomplishment for 2021. And we started disclosing against SASB and TCFD, which are two standards that we is leading the way on our side. A few other things that we've done during this year includes one that has been noticed by the market, is that when we outlined our strategic plan in December 2021, we announced that going forward, the bank will not directly finance the exploration, production, and development of coal or oil and gas, which is a big statement, but again, goes back to the values of the organization. In 2021, we also participated in the issuance of $6.3 billion of green and sustainable bonds. And we do offer for our personal customers mutual funds and various investments that are ESG related. Finally, but not the least, is that we worked a lot at improving our Sustainalytics score, and we increased by 6.9 points to be exact, but that really changed the category from medium risk to low risk and put us in the 98th percentile on the corporate governance score. So as you can see, it's important to us. We're embedded at all levels, and we're well on our way.
Thanks for that. That's a really important piece that I'm sure everyone can relate to, is having all of your policies and programs and initiatives kind of overlain with strong governance frameworks. So I'm sure that resonates with everyone on this panel as well. Steve, over to you. Canadian Infrastructure Bank, sort of a different kind of bank, but similarly, how are you seeing ESG and sustainable finance reflected in your work, and what are some highlights that you'd like to point to?
Thanks, Sandra, and thanks for having me here, and thanks to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. As you know, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, we're a fellow federal Crown corporation, and we are tasked with a policy problem of helping close Canada's infrastructure deficit. And what we try to do is provide concessional below market financing products, infrastructure projects in partnership with the private sector that meet pressing infrastructure needs on behalf of Canadians. We're invested exclusively in greenfield new infrastructure projects. We think about sustainability in three lenses. The first is we are always focused on the positive impact that those infrastructure projects are creating. What's the impact that it creates that justifies us providing a concessional financing product? We have defined a really clear set of outcomes: project-related greenhouse gas reductions supporting the energy transition, ridership with the public transit projects we finance, like the REM project in Montreal, connecting every Canadian to broadband, growing our economy through trade, and closing the Indigenous infrastructure gap for the Indigenous communities across the country. We rigorously measure and pay just as much attention to those impact outcomes as we do to the financial diligence that we put on each and every one of our investments. And it leads to us making investments like the one we announced yesterday in the Darlington New Nuclear Project, a small modular reactor that's going to contribute 740,000 tons of GHG reduction to Ontario's grid every year. And that's what justifies our participation and investment in the project. The second lens we look at it is as a sustainable infrastructure investor. And we're trying to both learn from and contribute to the community of practice here amongst infrastructure investors, thinking about how we bring sustainability and ESG considerations into our assessment of projects. So that's thinking about assessment of climate risk and how we look at climate risk over very long durations of our investment horizon, which can be 30 or 40 years on many of these projects. Second is, how do we use our financing tools to incent better behavior? So for example, we have a significant building retrofit program that provides low interest loans to building owners to do deep retrofits and reduce their GHG reduction. And we give folks an interest rate discount as they go deeper and deeper and achieve higher percentage GHG reductions. Third and finally, we're also thinking about it as a corporation. How do we work to lower our GHG footprint and integrate ESG into our operations? And we're just about 100 people, right? We're a much smaller scale investment fund relative to the pace of our capital deployment. And so we're thinking about how to get that balance right, because our primary impact that we have are the contribution to energy transition, and inclusion, and growth that we can have from our infrastructure investments.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much for that. I'm actually going to sort of pull the thread that's been touched on by a couple of the examples that were given of, current focus areas. And what I want to dig into a little bit is, and I think I'll pose this first maybe to Nicole at TD, but Nicole, you touched on how, with TD being, full service financial services company that includes insurance, and that of course is a sector that's very cognizant of the physical risks of climate change. And then of course, we've also got, I guess it was Marie-Justine at Desjardins, you talked about the track record on investment funds and how you're embedding climate related considerations in your investment fund development, as well as other aspects of Desjardins. So obviously, all of those on this panel are looking at the impacts of a changing climate, as well as the risks associated with changing climate policy and regulations and technologies, et cetera. What is that all going to mean for your business? One other example before I get to the question here is that central banks are also starting to incorporate climate risk, of course, as a stress testing feature for banks and insurers. So I guess what I'm curious about from, and I'm going to start with TD and Desjardins, and if anyone else wants to jump in afterwards, Nicole, to start with you, how do you see climate risk impacting TD's, ongoing and perhaps horizon investment and lending strategies? And also, how are you measuring and managing climate risk overall?
Yeah, I think TCFD, I think it was mentioned previously,
Yeah.
Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures. That's been a really helpful tool in helping us frame the challenge and frame out how we should be thinking about these types of risks. When we look at our lending and our investment portfolios, what we're doing is we're looking at all the companies within these portfolios in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions, and also in terms of their vulnerability to physical risks from our climate physical events. I think that's surprising to some people that, we go that deep and we look at, company by company, what are the GHG emissions, and, have they set commitments? Are they tracking towards those commitments? But it's something that we do. And what we also do is segment the portfolios by sector, but also by geography. Sector, because some sectors are more carbon intensive than others. Some are easier to abate than others. Geography, because we know the physical impacts of climate differ depending on where you are. And then we apply climate scenarios as well. And that's really to get a picture or the pictures of what business will look like in the future. And what this allows, it doesn't allow us to predict the future. We can't really pinpoint what it's going to look like in one concise view. But what it does allow us to do is identify the hot spots or the high risk areas. And we can use that analysis as an engagement tool with our clients and our companies to talk about climate related considerations, decarbonization strategies, climate adaptation strategies. And so I think this engagement, like these tools, this analysis is important for the engagement. And we have the goal of working with our clients on decarbonization and helping everyone, complete the journey together towards net zero by 2050.
Yeah, thanks for that. So Marie-Justine, I'm going to lob the same question over to you. How's climate risk impacting on your side, probably more investment strategy? So Nicole gave a really great overview that I think provides a good lens on a lender's perspective, although I know TD does the full gamut. But, you know, as you're in the responsible investment arm, how does it look from the investment side of the business, climate risk?
Thanks, Sandra. And I can give a bit of an overview and then dig deeper into the investment part. I guess the first thing to say is conceptually, we look at this through a double materiality lens. So we look at the risk that climate change poses to us as a business, but also our role in kind of contributing to the fight against climate change, if I can put it that way, because both are very important to us. So on the climate risk side, a bit like Nicole said, you know, there's kind of a bottom up and a top down approach, and both of them together really give you kind of a more complete view of the climate risk that the organization is facing. So bottom up, we equip teams, client-facing teams, investment teams with kind of ESG grid analysis, and we overlay some information on climate so that they can assess well, client by client, investment by investment, that kind of climate risk. But then at the organization level, there's also been a lot of work to assess how different types of climate risk affect different lines of business. And we see that that is very differentiated. So it's worth kind of digging into that level of detail. For example, we noticed that our kind of agriculture and real estate kind of sectors or business lines are more likely to be affected by physical risk, whereas extractive industries that we do business with are more likely to be affected by transition risk. So that means that the kind of action plan or the way that we can accompany these clients will be different. And our work is to continue to refine that analysis. And just like Yvonne talked about governance for ESG in the business, that's also something that we've looked at this year in terms of making our governance specifically for climate evolve. So what we've put together this year is really kind of an evolved climate governance system that really involves the 3 lines of defense. So we have a climate committee with the 3 lines of defense, with senior decision makers from the 3 lines of defense that are supported with working groups for the first line of defense and the second line of defense to make sure that we manage this risk really well. And then just touching on quickly on the kind of other side of the coin, which is kind of net zero alignment. So on that side, we've committed as a business to net zero in our operations, in the investment of our own funds, and in our financing. And we're going to focus on 3 key sectors, which is energy, real estate, and agriculture. And we've signed up the Business Alliance for 1.5 degrees, which means that what we're working on now are intermediate science-based targets.
Thanks very much for that. That provides a good, really well-rounded view of some of the considerations in managing climate risk under, you know, in different organizations. I'm actually thinking now, I would actually like to go to step away for a second from climate and environment, and maybe going over to Steve. I am interested in the S part, the sort of the kind of like the poor stepchild of environment when it comes to sustainability. Certainly climate has been dominating the conversation in the recent past anyway. But actually social issues are hugely important, and a few of the people on this call in the preamble talked about the important social you know, missions in your organizations. So my question is really a bit about the S and ESG. And, you know, as governments and companies are progressing on, certainly on environmental and climate commitments, we have to recognize that all this is done in the broader economic and geopolitical climate, where you know, it's a sustainability problem really, where yes, you want to push hard on environment, but you've got social and economic issues that you have to balance. We're seeing, you know, inflationary trends, rising energy costs, affordability concerns, super tight labor markets in Canada, and a heightened sensitivity to social and economic inequality. So regardless of what area of ESG we're focused on, we sort of can't get away from the fact that the social side of the equation is an important area of consideration. So I'm going to start with Infrastructure Bank with Steve. So how does the social side of ESG factor into um, the Infrastructure Bank's lending or investment considerations, and where are you seeing risks and opportunities in that regard?
Thanks, Sandra. You know, the CIB, the Infrastructure Bank, is becoming a bit of a model that's being replicated around the world. UK has launched an infrastructure bank. The US, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, is launching their first national green bank. And we are both a green bank and have a broader mandate. Roughly half of our investment activities are towards the climate transition in terms of our capital deployment, and the other half is really targeted at social and economic growth outcomes. As I said a little bit in my first response, we're accountable to Canadians through the government, through Parliament. Government gives us some priority sectors to focus on: transit, trade, broadband, green infrastructure, clean power. And then we source and originate investments in those space that deliver on real outcomes for Canadians. In terms of social, specifically, we think about a few places where we're really driving impact on those. First is around our programs with Indigenous communities. We've got a target of investing $1 billion in partnership with and to the benefit of Indigenous communities. Examples of projects like that are investment with an Indigenous-owned railway, Tichwetan Rails, that runs from Sept-Îles to Schefferville, Quebec, providing sort of the final connection for passenger rail to some quite remote Indigenous communities and to traditional territories. It's an investment where our ability to provide project finance tools at a smaller scale suited to the needs of an Indigenous community, the Indigenous communities that own that line, unlocks a really important project for that community. We've also invested with Indigenous communities in Saskatchewan, creating an urban reserve and providing the enabling infrastructure, sewers, roads, power, and broadband connections that's necessary for them to build out their urban reserve with access to office space, healthcare, etc. The second place that we're thinking about how we contribute to some of the challenges that you spoke about in your question, inflationary trends, rising energy costs, are a lot of our investments in the trade and transportation sector, where we're thinking about how do we increase the resiliency of our trading system and make the big investments that are required to pivot our economy to have the trading links it needs to support a net zero economy. So we're supporting the Port of Montreal in its procurement of expanded container volumes at Contrecoeur, at the Port of Contrecoeur terminal expansion. And we're having a lot of interesting conversations with project developers from coast to coast as they're thinking about how do they expand exports of clean fuels, hydrogen to global markets in Europe and Asia. What's the end-to-end supply chain from the ports back to production sites in order to bring Canadian clean energy exports globally?
Thanks for that. And just a slight follow-on before I ask Yvan. Do you see any areas in the social risk area? Do you see any particular risks, additional risks on the horizon that we should be paying attention to?
I think that the one commonplace that we think about within our S pillar, and we often think about it across sustainability more broadly, is around how we deliver projects in partnership with a really complex set of stakeholders, right? Bringing an infrastructure project all the way to market. And the private sector often wants, I'm ready to invest, just show me the project ready to go to procurement. Well, it takes building partnerships with municipalities, with Indigenous communities, securing environmental approvals. All those things need to come together at one point in time in order to bring a project to market. Yeah. And so it's about what are the partnerships we're able to build with other public sector stakeholders and other private sector stakeholders that are necessary to bring a project forward.
Yeah. You can't finance stuff if you can't get it built.
Exactly.
Yeah. I know that's very, very astute observation. Thank you for that. Yvan, same kind of thing. We're very curious, with Laurentian Bank, where does the S fit into your lending or investment considerations, and where are you seeing risks or opportunities related to social issues in your bank?
Yeah, happy to talk about the S. And first, thank you to Stephen to talk about the CIB projects. I think it's good that we hear, the projects that you're putting in place. So really happy and pleased to talk about the S because S is important to us. And I'll take a different twist at the end of my answer, but you'll see where I'm going then. So the S side of the ESG is broader, but I would say way less defined than what the E is and receive much less attention. But we can hear by example, I talk to a lot of investors and we see the S coming in really strongly in the discussions, right? So it takes a lot of attention right now, and I think it's for the benefit of everybody.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of attention on the E, like I mentioned. I'm in charge of the TCFD task force, but we need to better define what is the S as well. But I think there's still a lot of work being done on that side. And when we speak with the rating agencies and all that, you can see that there's openness to, what fits in the bucket. And I think it's good because there's a lot of things that we need to evolve in that category as well. So if we look at the S, some of the things that we've been working on the product side is really about items like affordable housing, access to essential services, things like support to groups that were more impacted by the pandemic. Definitely something that we're doing is support for the newcomers and the immigrants. That's something that also plays a key role in Canada in the development of Canada going forward. And one thing that people may not know about Laurentian as well is that we're one of the lead investors in terms of daycare in the province of Quebec. And that also plays a role in terms of the S, to give a break and opportunities to women and parents in the families. My little twist in that answer is that it starts with the employees, because the employees is really the base and the ambassadors that we want to drive the S with so that we can go to our customers and to the investors. So if my CEO would be here today, she would tell you that we intend to be leading on the S, but starting from the employees. So we've put a lot of things in place over the years, and it starts with simple things. Like we had the first chair of a bank in 1997, which was a female. We also had our board with equal representation for at least the last 6 years. We have the first CEO of a bank in Canada, which is a female right now. Like I mentioned previously, in all the objectives and the scorecards and also the compensation of the executives, we do have S factors that are part of it. And we do create a lot of employee resource groups because we believe that once you push the S with your employees, it goes from your employees to your customers, to your shareholders and other stakeholders. So for us, it's really a chain. And as we start with the employees, we believe it's really going to change the mindset of what we deliver to the customers and our investors. So as you can see, the S is pretty important for us. It's key and part of the ESG strategy. And really pleased to the fact that you've been putting some emphasis on the S today.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from you is that part of your strategy is to make sure your own house is in order on social issues. And the other thing I loved from what you said is you really showed the link between social and economic issues. They're very clearly tied like this, like economic growth, in a dwindling and aging population, immigration, like it's absolutely critical, but that brings with it social challenges. And you were talking about that. And similarly, as we all know, access to affordable childcare is enormously important in women's participation in the workforce, which is a pretty basic economic factor for families as well as for the whole country's productivity. So I think that's something that we all think about. I'm sure across, I can sort of see heads nodding on the panel across all the banks. I think that that also brings us to a question about how we talk about these things and how we share information with our stakeholders on what we're doing in regard to environmental, social, and governance priorities. So as you guys know better than anyone, there's a lot of different ESG disclosure frameworks and ratings frameworks out there. We've recently seen the newly formed ISSB, so the International Sustainability Standards Board, rolled out, with the intention of supporting accountability and standardization around sustainability metrics and reporting. But I think it's fair to say that the way that we disclose and the way that companies are rated on what they're doing is still evolving. So with that in mind, and I think I'm going to jump back to Laurentian for this one, is I'm just curious about how you see the how you're measuring your performance and whether you see challenges with standardization.
Thank you. And I think that's a great question, and one that for everybody that knows me is something that I've been pretty vocal around. So what I can say is the first thing is we really start by thinking, okay, what's our current state? What do we want to drive in terms of results, accountability, and what's our role as well in the society as part of this? So we really went through, and for a bank, data is very important, is really key in anything that we want to do with ESG. That's really key, and that's something that we have a plan forward in terms of quality of data, because for the ones that know a little bit more, the Sustainalytics, ratings and all that stuff, the quality of data is also very important. So we did consider and did an inventory of all the programs, the policies, the activities we have in each of the E, the S, and the Gs to build, what we want to put in place. But as a smaller organization, it's very important to take into account, the data and the time that is required, but also number of standards that are out there. And where I say that I've been vocal is I think it's very important that we all work towards a few key international standards so that for the investors and the stakeholders, it becomes easy to compare, understand the information, track, and all that stuff. So we got to make sure that especially in an industry that is highly regulated, we need to make sure that it's embraced by our regulators as well, because we do have great standards like SASB, TCFD that we discussed previously. So it's very important that we work towards having something that is more standard and that we all work, because I mentioned we're a smaller bank and we have limited resources. So it's very tough to follow 20 different, standards and benchmarks and all of that. And I'm sure it is also for the bigger organization. I see Marie-Justine knocking, but all of that to say that standardization for me is really a key item for all stakeholders, and really for me is the success factor that's going to bring that home.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to jump to one of the larger organizations who has been doing ESG reporting for quite some time, and that's TD. Nicole, what do you think? What are some of the challenges in terms of getting towards standardization on ESG performance disclosures?
Yeah, definitely suffered from reporting fatigue. So I'm really happy about the direction we're moving in. And just like looking at our team, it's really grown, over the past like 5-10 years. It used to be a team of like 1 or 2 people, and now it's like a team of 20, right? That just shows the amount of disclosure that is expected of us. And I think each of these types of disclosures has a role, like the third-party ratings. Those are important. Like I'm on a number of investor calls, and some investors, that's all they look at. Like, what's your rating, right? Because they don't have time. They cover so many companies. They don't have time to get into your disclosures and read them. Other investors will look at your actual disclosures, and they'll try to compare it to other banks, right? Like TD to other banks, and getting into the nitty gritty of the details. Like, why did you choose this? Why did you set targets this way? And that's really challenging. Challenging for the investors to really compare, because it's never apples to apples, right? So standardization, I hope, will help with that. And then I think the other type of reporting or disclosure that takes up a lot of our time is this direct engagement. So these meetings with investors or clients. But I think those are the most valuable because that's when you can really get into the issues. But I think the problem is you don't have enough time in the day or in the year to even meet with everyone, right?
Yeah.
So we need to look at some of these issues through standardization. I do worry that it's going to be difficult to get to a true apples to apples because these strategies are so technical, at least on the climate side. They're
Yeah.
so technical and there's so many details that if you're on the outside looking in, I think it's really hard to read a report and really get the gist of what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah. No small challenge here. I wanted to, so thanks for that. I wanted to actually ask Desjardins from, I guess, more from the investment side of the, of the business. What about the performance of ESG aligned investments? So, you've heard about the challenge of getting standardized measures, and we've heard a lot in the news, especially from south of the border, about some, I would call it some confusion, as well as building cynicism about some of the, some of it's very politically driven, but about ESG aligned investments. But there's certainly a lot of evidence that they perform well, and they are very desired by investors. So, what do you see, and from Desjardins' point of view, in the future for the performance of sustainable investments as well as ESG aligned investments?
Yeah, well, first looking at what we know from the data so far, it's easy to look at kind of the short term or the anecdotal evidence. What we try to look at is what studies and kind of academic level in terms of rigorous studies say on this. And the last kind of meta study that we saw on this took findings from over 1,000 studies that were done on the topic between 2015 and 2020. And the overall finding was that, as you said, responsible investment funds usually perform on par, could outperform their traditional equivalents. So the data is out on that. If you look at long-term and if you look at kind of overall findings. And then in terms of what the future holds, I don't have a crystal ball, and I know better than to guarantee that past performance is a guarantee of future returns. But having said that, I mean, if you just look at the kind of mega trends in the economy, in our society, and how they're likely to unfold in the future, I mean, let's think about climate change and how it's been called, the greatest challenge of our time, the place that diversity and inclusion, the importance it's taking in our society to address it correctly, especially in kind of younger generations. If you look at all these environmental and social trends, it's a no-brainer that taking them into considerations in the way that you invest is a winner, because if you don't, then you have this huge blind spot about who are going to be the winners and the losers of the economy tomorrow. So to me, that's really a no-brainer. And I think beyond that, I mean, we see strong interest in responsible investment from all parts of society, but especially from younger generations. So I think in any case, it's really worth kind of addressing that need that is being expressed by younger generations.
Yeah, thanks for that. Also, I think and I hope the investors are going to become more sophisticated and thoughtful in their understanding of what it is what type of responsible investment suits what they really want. And that I think that'll be good for everybody. And I think we're starting to see that. Does that sound right?
Absolutely. And I think as an industry, we have a role in educating investors as well, especially retail investors, on what's responsible investment, what are the different approaches that are available. And that's definitely something you can play a role in.
Before we turn it over to questions from the audience, I wanted to just pull one final thread, and it's around the climate change conversation again a little bit. it wouldn't be an ESG or sustainability panel if we didn't talk about net zero, right? So I wanted to know, actually, from the Infrastructure Bank, I'm very curious about whether CIB's investments or projects are aligned to the transition to net zero. Do you want to say a few words about that, Steve? Sorry, you're on mute. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Sandra. You know, the CIB was set up 4 or 5 years ago. And so we have a different set of challenges in terms of aligning our portfolio to net zero than many of the financial institutions with much longer histories. We've now reached just over $8 billion of investment and $24 billion of projects. 6 billion of that is in the last 18 months.
Right.
So we're making real progress on deploying capital into projects that support the energy transition. And the vast majority of projects that we're investing in are projects that are leading to direct, measurable GHG reductions, whether that's investments in renewables, interprovincial transmission to connect provinces with clean grids to provinces that are trying to figure out how to decarbonize their grids, clean fuels, hydrogen, those sorts of things. We're also working with building owners to do deep building retrofits, or we've invested with Algoma Steel, which is a steel mill in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, to convert from a blast furnace to an electric arc furnace, where that's a 3.5 megaton reduction in GHG. But we're working with those project owners, and we recognize that there is some residual emissions that still come from those projects. And so we're thinking, one, how can we mobilize capital as quickly as possible to transition towards our whole economy towards net zero? And then the second is, and this is a real priority for us over the next year, is to understand our financed emissions profile and think about that with our project owners, how we can work to get that aligned to net zero. But I think as you think about the CIB, the vast majority of our portfolio are in either projects that directly support the energy transition or in projects that are not in sectors that we would typically be high risk from a net zero alignment, whether that's a broadband expansion or a public transit project.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So we have a few minutes for Q&A. I'm assuming that our colleagues at the Chamber will be posting them in the chat for me and the panelists to see. Chamber of Commerce, do we have any questions from the audience? Because we can't see. Oh, here we go. All right, so we have a question from the audience. So the question is, do investment decisions that support environmental, social, and governance considerations also need to consider financial returns? I feel like this is a trick question, but probably an easy one. I'm going to ask, it wasn't directed at anyone in particular, so I'm just gonna, you know what, I feel like all four of you could answer this in one word. Nicole, why don't you kick it off?
Yes.
Marie-Justine?
I'll just add, at the beginning, I was talking about how we see ESG, and it's really an overlay to what we're already doing. So any investment or financing decision, yes, considers the return, but we also want to overlay what are the ESG considerations as well.
Right. Great explanation. Thanks. Marie-Justine?
Yeah, very hard to answer in one word. I'd say
one sentence.
I mean, for commercial institutions that, typically you're looking at market rate returns for your investments. So you also need to consider financial returns. And then there can be actors in the economy that may be able to provide below market returns. But I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you.
If I can jump in as
yes.
the CFO of the bank, you
I know what your answer is.
Yeah, that's an important question. So what I would say is a lot of people look at this and see that as a cost, but I think there's a transition where we need to see that as an opportunity. And as the world transition as well, we have to go in that direction and really take that in or change the cost into opportunities. But for me, it's something that's going to be a transition there. but there is no break, unfortunately, from my investors to say, you can spend money and not make money on it. So definitely we need to take that into account. But if you look a bit midterm and longer term, I think there is a great opportunity that we need to embrace and take.
Thank you. And Steve, do you want to?
I think the thing that we see is that there is some, projects that have ESG benefits, but don't have the base case financial return necessary to do it. But often what's stopping a project is specific risks or uncertainty, or needing to take a really long time horizon. And so what we try to do as the CIB and Justine, you reference this, is for projects that you may be developing that don't quite hit the financial return profile, but have those really strong ESG benefits, how can we structure a creative financial product that allows that product to go forward, achieving your return hurdles and ours, measured both in impact and financial performance, but maybe over a longer time horizon or with a different risk profile than a traditional investor?
Yeah. So I think that's a really important point, is there are ways to, there are different mechanisms and organizations whose role it is to de-risk or help level out the risk return profile. And obviously CIB plays an important role in that regard in Canada. Another really great question here is about, we see that we're headed towards a global economic slowdown. And so if that continues, do you think that's going to impact the access to capital for sustainable development projects? I actually feel this is a bit of a Steve question, and maybe Nicole.
I think what we're certainly seeing is a need to get projects going as quickly as possible, because as they think about how they're responding to access to supply chain and supply chain challenges, inflation, we're seeing sustainable projects facing increasingly difficult business cases. Revenues haven't gone up and the costs of construction are experiencing inflation. And so that's an opportunity for us. We're always thinking about how we can provide our financing tools to help close that gap. And we think about ways we can provide earlier access to capital. We have a project acceleration fund so that you can start ordering long lead items and those sorts of things, perhaps before you're ready to make the final investment decision. Try to mitigate some of those risks. So we're not so much on the access to capital side, but we're certainly seeing it on some of the challenges that project developers are facing developing in current economic conditions.
Yeah. Actually, you know what? I am going to lob the last question at Nicole, but I'm going to take the last question that we have time for. So I'm going to switch gears a little, because this is an interesting one. Nicole, do you have any thoughts on whether COP27, which is happening very soon in Egypt, is going to have any material impact on sustainable finance or climate finance? We know COP26 was all about sustainable finance last year. Is this one going to have any material impacts from what you could see so far?
I think, yes, I definitely think so. We have GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, led by Mark Carney. So, GFANZ is going to be there in full force, along with the alliances underneath: Net Zero Banking Alliance, Asset Managers Alliance, Insurance Alliance, Underwriters Alliance, Asset Owner Alliance. And I think, last year, they were just getting started. They were just formed. I think this year we're going to have to get into really the details and the mandates of GFANZ and other net zero alliances. And I think there's going to be some strong calls to action for us, all the members of those alliances. So I will be at COP. I'm looking forward to it. So I can bring you back the details.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to hearing. I'm sure we'll hear about it on the news, but the word on the ground is always better. Okay, thank you very much for audience questions. I think we're going to have to wrap it up. I want to ask the panel before we wrap up for this session, rapid fire. I'm going to give you 1 minute or less to answer this, and it's really about the government. So Government of Canada, it's investing over $120 billion in climate and environmental action. It's put forward some pretty ambitious policies to decarbonize, including the Federal Emission Reduction Plan, a very tricky escalating price on carbon, very tricky when you're in a constitutional format that we have in Canada, where you've got to get a lot of different actors to align. So lots of stuff going on in that regard, but my question to you is, if you could give the government of Canada one piece of advice, what could they do to help ensure sustainable financing accelerates national progress on climate change and other environmental issues? What would be your advice? Like 1 minute or less. Who wants to start? Put your hand up. Turn off your camera and hide, whichever. Yvonne, was that your hand or were you scratching your nose?
It's okay. Let's say it was my hand for my glasses,
Okay,
but
so you're going to
I'll
start.
I'll take it on. So I'll keep it very short. So the governments have, net zero goals. I think it's great as for the country. What we need is also their help to support the industries and the companies to make sure that we're going in that directions. And not only the big ones, but also the small organizations, because us as financial institutions, we need the small entities as well to help us in terms of data and support. So for me, it's very key. But my key song is really about, just making sure that we don't recreate the wheel, and we need to align with international standards. So for me, it's the song I played a few minutes ago, and which for me is the key success factor of all of this.
Thank you. Nicole.
I completely agree. And, if I think about how the bank, TD Bank, carries out a big transformative project, right? You have a whole team of professionals involved. Like you have a whole project team. You have change management, project management, you have your risk experts, your technical experts, you have clear governance, roles and responsibilities, you have an overall plan and a change management plan. And I think that's what we really need. I think we have a good emissions reduction plan. Government is doing a fantastic job at de-risking. I think more de-risking of these transformative projects needs to happen. But we need an overarching plan, clear roles and responsibility that includes everyone in the economy and making sure that we're on track. Because I fear that all these great projects are going on, but I worry it's patchwork. And at the end of it, the outcomes are not going to add up to net zero by 2050. Like who's overseeing the whole picture?
Who's the conductor of the orchestra here?
Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you. Steve.
Sure. I think, for us, the thing that we see is that the need for investment to achieve our net zero ambitions is really large. Pick your study, 2 trillion by 2050. That's far larger than what any entity can do it on its own. It's going to take a partnership from multiple levels of government and from the private sector to mobilize the capital that we need. And that's going to require institutions like the CIB, like the BDC, others, to find ways to de-risk projects, to move really quickly, to be able to mobilize the private capital that's required on the scale and the speed to get projects built. 2030 is only 80 months away. And as we're building infrastructure projects, that means we got to get started today in order to get them built.
Thank you. So de-risk, move quickly. Marie-Justine, you get the last word. What should the government do?
Oh, lucky me. Well, I'm really kind of on the same page as my co-panelists. I think the businesses are the best position to know the details of how they can transition. They know their business is the best, and where the government can play a part is really in terms of providing a supportive policy environment, stable and clear messaging on the evolution of that policy environment, de-risking, supporting technologies that are not yet commercially viable, and just making sure the risk return profiles of the projects that we need work. So
yeah, great. Thank you. Perfect note to end on. So I want to say thank you to everyone on the panel for those insights. What a great way to close out today's event. Hopefully, government, hope you're listening. I know I took notes. I'll be happy to share at any opportunity your really thoughtful insights throughout the panel session. I want to thank everyone on the panel today, as well as our special guest, Robert R.J. Johnson, for a stellar keynote. It really set the tone for the day's discussions. And also, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsors and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce's membership for making today happen. Thank you very much for that. And of course, a big thank you to each and every one of you who joined us today. today in the audience for taking time to be part of the conversation. This marks the final formal event in the Canadian Chamber's 2022 Executive Summit Series, but they're going to be back in the new year with what is sure to be another outstanding series of discussions on the biggest issues for Canadian business. So thanks again, and everyone have a great rest of your week. Take care.